If it helps to try and get you in the mood for today's episode, you should probably have a listen to some Fleetwood Mac before we get going. Hello everybody, welcome to the re-review, the series where I get to replay and reassess games from my favourite gaming era. I'm Brian, also known as UKGN Zoidberg, and in this series I'm taking a look at all the memorable Amiga games from my lifetime, seeing what the critical consensus was for each, and then seeing whether or not those opinions still stack up all these years later. This month I've added a couple more physical copies of Amiga games to my collection, including the boxed copy of Roadcraft that finally arrived and looks amazing, but also on a recent visit to Nottingham Gaming Market, I picked up two boxed games that I've been searching for a while, one of which was Cannon Fodder, which I'll be covering on this series at some point in the new year, and then the subject of today's video. Today I'm going to be donning my racing overalls, pulling on my helmet, and then sitting there and waiting for the green light as I re-review Jeff Cramond's Formula 1 Grand Prix, which was released by Microprose in late 1991. During the 1980s, long before I played games on the Amiga, I was an avid reader of games magazines. Titles such as Your Sinclair, Sinclair User and Crash magazine would land on my doorstep every month. I would devour every issue cover to cover and take note of all the scores that were handed out to games in their reviews. Safe to say, I probably wouldn't be stood here today doing this if I hadn't. When John Rittman's mighty Head Over Heels was given the highest score that I'd ever seen of 97% in issue 39 of Crash magazine, I thought it would be a long time before any other game would come close. As it turned out, The Sentinel from Jeff Cramond would receive the exact same score just one issue later. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that I have tried to play The Sentinel quite a few times over the years, and I've never really understood what you're supposed to do. I could, however, appreciate both its artistry and its ambition. As for the Amiga version, it was converted by Steve Back, who's probably more well known for Robocod and Bad Company, and I'll probably talk about him in a future episode. Jeff Cramond hadn't set out to become a games designer, and only really set about making them as a hobby while working as a systems engineer. In 1982, he bought himself a BBC Micro and decided to try his hand at making his own flight simulator. The resulting game was Aviator, which was praised for its unmatched levels of realism. In order to fund its development, Cramond had made the game Super Invaders for publisher Acornsoft, and that established his connection with the publisher. Following the success of Aviator, he turned his attention to racing games, despite claiming to have no interest whatsoever in motorsport. Revs was released for the BBC Micro in 1985 and featured just one circuit, Silverstone. It did, however, make enough of an impact to get a conversion to the Commodore 64, as well as an enhanced release with 5 more tracks. Next up was The Sentinel, which was first released for the BBC by Firebird Software in 1986, with conversions following shortly after for the Commodore 64, Amstrad, Spectrum, PC, Atari ST and Amiga. There was also a sequel to that game released in 1998 called Sentinel Returns, developed for the PlayStation by Psygnosis. However, for that game, Cramond only received a credit for having come up with the concept. Stunt Car Racer came next, a more arcade-leaning racing title with impressive driving physics and fast-moving 3D graphics. This was a game that I actually bought twice, once for the Atari ST and then again when I upgraded to the A500. This was also one of the first games that I ever played against my friends where we linked two computers together in the same room. As good as that game was though, it was nowhere near as ambitious as what was to come next. EA's Indianapolis 500 had proven that it was possible to create an accurate and playable simulation of real-life motorsport, but that game only had one track in it. What if you were to do the same with all 16 tracks from a full season of Formula 1? That's exactly what we got with the release of Formula 1 Grand Prix, known as World Circuit in the US. All 16 tracks from the 1991 season, all recreated accurately, complete with all liveries and helmets. We'll get into what the critical reception for the game was in a second, but it was a sales smash, staying in the All Formats Top 20 for multiple weeks following its release. The fan community has even kept the game updated with current cars and drivers to this very day. It was followed by 3 sequels, all released for the PC, that used advances in technology to increase the realism of each game. Unfortunately, Grand Prix 4 has become synonymous for having been released in a bug-ridden state. This was due to the publisher demanding that the game be released before EA's F1 2002, and subsequently that meant that the game wasn't playtested enough before hitting shelves. A version of Grand Prix 4 was also in development for the Xbox, but ultimately not released due to the low sales of the PC version, despite the fact that it was almost complete. It remains the final game on Jeff Cramman's small but impressive CV. As I've made this series, I've discovered that there aren't many games where the praise handed out to them was universal. There's usually at least one reviewer who doesn't agree with everybody else, but Formula 1 Grand Prix is that rare exception. Every single review was an extremely positive one, but the highest score came in the November 1991 issue of CU Amiga. Reviewer Dan Slingsby called it one of the best games ever released for the Amiga, and went into great detail as to why over 3 pages before awarding it 95%. Both the One Amiga and Zero gave out scores of 93%, and multi-format magazine Ace essentially did the same with their 930 out of 1000 review. Amiga Format and Amiga Power both agreed that 92% was the ideal score, with Amiga Action giving it 90%, while at the same time placing it at number 2 on their Racing Game Super League behind Lotus 2. The lowest score actually came from Games X magazine, where it wasn't actually me who reviewed it. The score given by Nick Walkland was 4 X's out of 5, although if you actually read the review, it's a pretty glowing assessment, saying that he couldn't recommend the game highly enough. Having worked alongside Nick, and knowing that he wasn't really into motorsport or racing games, preferring football instead, although being a Sheffield Wednesday fan that's debatable, that probably influenced the score. From a total of 8 reviews that I found, the average score was a very impressive 91%. Now let's take the game out for a spin again. It's time for the playtest.
Okay, when you first load the game up, this is the option that appears on screen in front of you. You get quick race or main menu. So let's just, before we do anything else, let's just do a quick race. So this is taking me to Silverstone, and the things that you can see at the bottom of the screen are the various assists that you have. So I'm going to leave automatic gears off. I'm going to turn off auto centering. You have a racing line, but I'm also going to press F6, which will give me the recommended gear for the corner. I think things like the recommended racing line are something that we take for granted in racing games these days, but this is probably the first game where I remember it being included. This has all the drivers and cars and circuits from the 1991 season, which was probably my era of Formula 1. Like Ayrton Senna, Nigel Mansell, Gerhard Berger. Fortunately, the controls remain as responsive today as they were back in 1991. The engine noise does begin to grate a little bit. I'm not gonna lie. And I definitely prefer this variation of the Silverstone circuit to what F1 drivers race around today. What I do notice is that the racing line in this one doesn't actually tell you when you're supposed to slow down. You still have to rely on your own judgment for that one. So I think that I actually prefer this kind of racing line to what games show these days. There's not much player agency on modern racing games for that reason. There we go. The game will now continue to go on until all 20 cars have crossed the line. But you can press the arrow keys to have a look at some of the other views. The game does actually come packaged with a key reference card telling you what you can press to have a look at things. Action replay mode is apparently the insert key. Right, what I always like to do in the game options menu is turn on fast windows. As you can see in the race options, you've got all these different options of how long you want your practice periods to be, what sort of race distance you want to do, whether you want to do 100% race distance. You can set the difficulty of your opponents. I'm going to put them to amateur, I think, and I'll leave it at 1991 skill level, so all the drivers will be as good as you remember them being. And so these are all the circuits that are included. San Marino Grand Prix, the Canadian Grand Prix, a lot of these circuits are still on the calendar today. Germany is obviously a vastly different circuit back in 1991 to what it is today. But I'm going to go for the Brazilian Grand Prix because the weekend that you're going to be watching this video is the weekend of the current Brazilian Grand Prix. So we're going to be racing around Interlagos. So we've got a 14-minute qualifying session. So I'm going to use the qualifying tyres and let's see what we can do. I forgot that back in the day there was no pit lane speed limit like there is today. So despite the fact that this has a maximum frame rate of only 25 frames a second, I'd say you'd still get a pretty decent sense of speed as you're playing it. So because the 3D engine that powers this game is a software-based one rather than a hardware-based one, it means that running it on modern hardware, it doesn't make it incredibly unplayable, and because it's so fast and smooth like some other games. I think Vroom did that and you had to enter some special codes to slow it back down again. This is one of the few circuits where it's pretty much the same today as it was back in 1991. Right, here we go, flying lap. Apparently that's put me 7th on the grid. 10% race distance is 7 laps. Okay. Let's get past that Ferrari. As you will notice, in the first lap of the race, the suggested gear that it's telling me for the corners is actually lower than it was for qualifying. And that's simply because the tyres have not been warmed up yet, which is a really nice touch. One thing that I always used to like on this game was the hot seat multiplayer that was an option. Basically, if you raced a 40-lap race, the game would let you race for 10 laps, then the computer would take control of your car, while the next player would then race for 10 laps. And it was always a really good way that me and my brother and my friends used to play this game against each other. Although it was always annoying that the computer driving cars were never quite as fast as I could have been. But obviously the best way to play this game in multiplayer was always to try and link 2 Amigas together with 2 TVs and 2 copies of the game. Something that was quite difficult to do back in the day and even harder to do today. Once you start to really get into the groove, the game does flow incredibly well. What it doesn't seem to tell me is how far ahead or behind the next cars are. I've just noticed that. Fastest lap. Not that that does anything for me, because you don't get a bonus point for fastest lap in this game, because that wasn't a thing back in 1991. The entire scoring system was far more interesting back then, to be honest. You only got points if you finished in the top 6, and you only got 10 points for a win. Bonus points for anybody in the chat who can tell me what team he drove for, because I can't even remember that one. And I've limped home to a 12th place finish. Oh dear. Oh yeah, it does work. Pressing Alt and D does change the graphical detail. So as you can see, I've got lots of trees alongside the road there, and they've now gone. This is my favourite version of the Hockenheim circuit, with long fast straights and chicanes at the end of them where you can overtake. But anyway, I think that's where we're going to leave the playtest for today. Let's move on to the final summary.
For any fan of Formula 1, there are many ways that you can experience the thrill of racing on the Amiga. For arcade racing fans, there's the likes of F17 Challenge or Vroom, whereas for sim racers, there are good quality games like Grand Prix Circuit or Nigel Mansell's World Championship. However, as far as I'm concerned, Formula 1 Grand Prix still beats them all hands down, even if the 3D graphics have dated a little. Despite the low frame rate, by today's standards at least, the sensation of speed is consistently brilliant. And old technology aside, the game still plays incredibly well. The assortment of driving assists means that anyone can play it regardless of their skill level. I really enjoyed racing around the older versions of circuits like Silverstone and Hockenheim, and it made me wish that there was a modern game that would let me do the same. Whether all you want is a quick race or to play through an entire championship season, the option is here. The hot seat multiplayer is still a fantastic way to play the game with your friends, but it's a real shame that, unless you're playing it on original hardware, there's no way to play in link-up mode on the A500 Mini. If the people from Retro Games Limited are watching, then online capability is the one thing that any potential A500 Maxi needs to have. Maybe for this game more than any other. There's simply no question that Formula 1 Grand Prix remains the best racing game on the Amiga, although, as you can see from the Retro Game Super League, there's also a lot of strong competition out there. The unprecedented level of support that this game still gets from the community today, for those that have the patience to install it at least, and the fact that it still plays wonderfully, means that this is definitely going to get an essential 10 out of 10 from me. Thank you for watching this episode of the re-review. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure that you give us a like and subscribe if you did. If you are new to this series, why not check out the playlist of all 59 previous episodes in this series, which should be on screen about now. The next episode in this series will be coming up in 2 weeks' time, and if there are any games out there that you'd like to see me cover in a future episode, please let me know in the comments, along with any memories that you have of playing Formula 1 Grand Prix. If you'd like to watch those episodes earlier than anyone else, along with all our other Amiga videos like Retro Game Super Leagues and Best 10, then why not check out our VIP membership offer in the video description. It costs just $1.99 a month, and early access is just one of the perks that you'll get, alongside the fact that you will now get to watch full replays of any live streams that we do on the channel. Hopefully I'll see you all next time, and until then, happy retro gaming, bye for now.